Our first speaker this morning, Stephan Kinsella. He's a patent attorney from Houston and the editor of Libertarian Papers. And his lecture this morning is going to be on intellectual property and economic development. Stephan?
Thanks, Mark. Very glad to be here at the Mises University. I was here a couple of years ago, and it's always a great thing. So let me get right off the bat. I have a lot to cover, so I will try to go as quickly as possible without going too fast. So most of you should be already familiar with the basic idea of praxeology. There's a reason I'm going to start with this. It'll become clear in a moment. So praxeology is the formal study of the implications of the fact that men use means to attain various ends. What we do is we start with incontestable or a priori propositions that are related to human action and its categories. Primarily, for purposes of our lecture today, humans employ scarce means to pursue ends. And there are, of course, other categories implied in action, such as causality, choice, cost, profit, and loss. Now, another aspect of economic analysis is contingent facts. After we recognize and establish what the a priori categories of action are, we explicitly introduce certain contingent facts to make the analysis interesting. As Hoppe explains, Mises explains the entire body of economic theory as implied in and deducible from conceptual understanding of the meaning of action, plus a few general, explicitly introduced assumptions about the empirical reality in which action is taking place. So in other words, we make some assumptions to make the analysis more interesting and more relevant to our lives. And Mises, of course, talks explicitly about this. So the branches of praxeology, we're having some technical issues here. The branches of praxeology would include both catalactics and, say, Crusoe economics, for example. So, for example, we would assume private property rights and a market to make the analysis interesting. We would assume that there's a money society, for example, instead of just barter. Okay? So economic analysis presupposes some legal system as well and property rights framework. In a market economy, this includes at least private property and scarce resources and related rights like contract, negotiable instruments, promissory notes and debt, service contracts, and so on. So when you see economists reason about a banking system or an economy, they're taking for granted or they're assuming that there is in place a certain legal system, a certain respect for private property rights. So these are not a priori assumptions. These are explicitly introduced background assumptions about the nature of legal rights that are possessed by actors. Now, we talked about economics is just a branch of praxeology according to Mises. It's the most developed branch so far. What other branches of praxeology could there be? And of course, economics can include Crusoe economics and catalactics. Mises says that other branches could include the study of war, game theory, things like this. Now, Roger Long has a comment that the way we sometimes use economics is so broad that it's basically the same thing as praxeology, so it's not clear what types of fields would not be included in economics that would be praxeology. But in any case, you will see Austrians explicitly use praxeological analysis and economic analysis to analyze the effects of aggression as well as private property and the free market. For example, Mises analyzes the hampered market economy and state interventionism, and Rothbard analyzes the effects of violent intervention in the market. So in this case, the explicitly introduced assumptions is the existence of a state and certain interventions in the economy that contravene some kind of baseline private property rights that we would analyze in a free market economy situation. Now, I'll bring this up because we want to talk about intellectual property, and we need to understand what we mean by the term and how it plays a role in economic analysis. So, over the last couple of centuries in the Western legal systems, the Western legal systems have protected, along with property rights and scarce resources, so-called intellectual property or IP rights. It's called industrial property in Europe, primarily. Now, as a general matter, you can think of IP in the legal sense as legal rights related to creations of the intellect or the mind. That's why the word intellect is used. It traditionally includes four main types: patent and copyright, which I've bolded here because this is going to be the main focus of the discussion. Patents are basically a monopoly privilege granted by the state covering the exclusive right to make or use or sell an invention. Say, think of a mousetrap. And a copyright is a similar monopoly privilege to be the exclusive person who can copy or distribute or perform publicly certain original works of expression, like novels or paintings or movies. And then, of course, we have trademark and trade secret. Trademark identifies the source of goods, like the Coca-Cola mark tells you you're getting the Coca-Cola from a certain manufacturer. And trade secrets describe useful knowledge that you keep secret that helps you gain a competitive advantage and that the state provides certain protections for. So we're going to focus primarily on patent and copyright. Now, these aren't the only rights. These rights arose, say, roughly 200 years ago in the West in a systematic modern form. But over the years, there have been others added, such as boat hull designs, the semiconductor maskwork protection. Trademark law was amended in '95 to add a dilution right, anti-dilution right. Of course, most of you may be familiar with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of '98, which has resulted in a lot of these takedown notices on YouTube. There's a No Electronic Theft Act in '97, and even the Economic Espionage Act of '96 has some IP aspects to it. And of course, there's pending legislation and worldwide treaties. There's the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, which is pending, the Protect IP Act in the US. There's current clamoring for fashion rights. The fashion industry is not currently protected very much by IP and even database rights. So the term intellectual property, think of it in two different ways. It's used in the legal way that I've been describing to describe state-granted rights. But it's important here to recognize patent and copyright were not originally called property. And Fritz Machlup and Edith Penrose, in a famous study, 1950, explained that those who started using the word property in connection with inventions had a very definite purpose in mind. They wanted to substitute a word with a respectable connotation, property, for a word that had an unpleasant ring, privilege. So it was basically a concerted propaganda campaign to sell these ideas, because there was some opposition among free market economists and other people to the idea of the government granting these privileges in a systematic way in a modern free market economy to certain people that applied. Now, if you talk to businessmen and investors, they will often use the term IP, or intellectual property, just to refer to the knowledge that their company has or that a given target company has. They don't really mean patent and copyright. You know, they'll talk about, well, my IP, and they mean their secret sauce or the knowledge that the employees have, the way they have of doing things, what makes them unique. This usage is not incompatible with the free market and really has little to do with the state. In this meaning, the investor or the businessman, they would think of patent and copyright as just one legal way of protecting your so-called IP or your knowledge, but it's not the same thing as it. So for purposes of today's lecture and for purpose of economic analysis, we need to analyze each type of IP differently. We need to analyze state interventions that protect knowledge differently than the way we analyze the use of knowledge by actors and by entrepreneurs. So let's think of what the role of scarce means are in action and also knowledge. So both scarce resources and knowledge are essential categories of action. This is why I started with praxeology. The structure of human action is essential to understand for purposes of seeing the role of knowledge and scarce resources. So the role of scarce resources in action, of course, is to be a means. Human action employs scarce means. A scarce means is that which is causally efficacious at achieving your end. So when you act, whether you're an entrepreneur or any individual, even doing a non-commercial activity, you have some end in mind, some goal you want to achieve. You have to select a means that will help you achieve that, and your action employs that means. These means, as Mises explained, are necessarily scarce. A scarce means is something that can only be used by one actor at a time. If two or more actors attempt to use this means, then there's necessarily conflict. Okay? Now, what's the role of knowledge in action? So the role of knowledge in action, you can think of knowledge as basically information, recipes, as Rothbard called it, ideas. They're a guide to action. As Mises wrote, action is purposive conduct. It is not simply behavior, but behavior begot by judgments of value, aiming at a definite end and guided by ideas concerning the suitability or the unsuitability of definite means. This is in Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science. Guido Hülsmann also has some good stuff on this, so do a lot of other Austrian writers, including Rothbard. So I'll elaborate on this further on in the lecture, but knowledge enriches and expands the universe of ends and means. This is why it's useful in action. So let me give a simple example. Imagine that your end is to satisfy your hunger. Let's say you're hungry. So this is what Mises might call a felt uneasiness. You're uneasy at the prospect of not eating something in the near future because you'll even get hungrier. So you want to satisfy your hunger. So you want to satisfy it in a way that you would enjoy. So you want some delicious food. Now, from your past knowledge and experience, you're aware of the possibility of making, let's say, a cake. You're aware that you like cakes. You're aware that you have ingredients and the ability to make a cake, scarce resources. You're aware of the technique you would use to make a cake. And you're aware of different types of cakes. So let's say you consider your ends. You can make a chocolate cake or a lemon cake. These are two ends that you consider. This is where choice comes into play. The human actor chooses which end he wants to pursue, and the one he doesn't choose would be the opportunity cost of the action. So all these action categories play a role here. Now, then the actor considers, based upon his knowledge, which means he's going to employ to achieve his end. Let's say he settled on the lemon cake. So he knows there are different means he can employ to achieve this lemon cake. He can purchase one from a store, he could hire someone to bake it, he could even steal it from someone, or he could acquire the ingredients or use the ingredients he has at hand and bake the cake himself. So he considers these different means, and then he makes a choice about what means he uses to achieve his end. So in this way, knowledge guides the actions that humans engage in, guides the selection of means and the selection of ends. Now, imagine if you acquire more knowledge. You acquire knowledge of another type of cake, like coconut cake. Well, now, if you're aware of this coconut cake, you're aware of 3 choices instead of 2. So your universe of ends has been expanded by knowledge. So if you prefer coconut to chocolate and lemon, and if you choose the coconut, now you're better off than before because it's preferable to you over what the lemon was. So this knowledge helps to increase your wealth or your subjective satisfaction. Contrary, also, if you know of another way to make a cake or to obtain a cake because of your technical knowledge, this helps you possibly choose a more efficient way to achieve your end. So you can see that knowledge, the more knowledge that's available, the more efficient action is, the more wealth-generating action is, because we have more ends and means. Jeff Tucker and I wrote a few months ago an article trying to classify the role of knowledge and put it in the structure of human action and in economic theory, especially Austrian theory. And you know, basically you can think of the means you use to achieve your ends as scarce goods, but you can think of knowledge like recipes, ideas, information as non-scarce goods. Of course, there's other things that you can call non-goods. Scarce non-goods would be like a mud pie. It's a scarce resource, but it's not a good because it's not useful, or poison, or some of these are Jeff Tucker's examples. Now, a non-scarce, non-good would be something like a bad idea or an awful sound or gibberish text. It's not useful and it's not scarce. So this is a way to think about the role of knowledge and how to classify knowledge, and to contrast it with what scarce resources are. Okay, so now let's think about property rights and scarcity. Given this understanding of the role of scarce means, what is the purpose of property rights? The very purpose of property rights is it's in response to this scarcity, is to permit conflict avoidance. It's basically to assign an owner to a given scarce resource so that the resources, the means, can be used productively and cooperatively. So this, of course, promotes efficiency in the division of labor. And as a simple example, let's go back to the cake idea. You know, if I'm baking a cake, if I'm making it myself, I might need a mixing bowl and ingredients, a spoon, my oven, a kitchen, my own body, standing room, time, and knowledge as well. If I'm making the cake and my neighbor wants to also make a similar cake at the same time, we can't use the same spoon at the same time. And if he takes my spoon from me, he's deprived me of the ability to make it. And in fact, if we fight over the spoon, we're both engaged in the activity of conflict, and we're not going to be productively engaged in using the resources. We're going to be engaged in destruction and clashing and war. So the purpose of property rights is to allocate an owner to the spoon so that it can be used at least by that person productively. But if my neighbor has his own ingredients, his own spoon, his own mixing bowl, and we both know how to make this coconut cake, we can both use the same recipe at the same time. We don't need ownership of that recipe in order to use it productively as action. That knowledge can guide, we can each use that knowledge to guide our actions at the same time. So this is how property rights are used for scarce goods, but they make no sense for knowledge. So given this, what is the nature and the function of the IP rights the state does grant? That is the monopoly privileges the state does grant in ideas in the form of patent and copyright. So what they do is they don't protect property rights, although they're called intellectual property rights. They restrict the flow of information. This is what they do. They restrict the use and flow of information. And you can see from our previous discussion that the more knowledge actors have, the better. And if you restrict it, it can only be harmful to economic productivity. In fact, there's a free market economist who wrote fairly recently in favor of patent and copyright. He said, to paraphrase the late economist Joan Robinson, patent and copyright slow down the diffusion of new ideas for a reason, to ensure there will be more new ideas to diffuse. Now, I wouldn't agree with the latter comment, the latter part of his statement, but he's admitting that patent and copyright slow down the diffusion of ideas. And this is supposed to be an argument in favor of this. Another advocate of IP, now he's not a free market advocate as far as I know, he's just a standard law professor. He wrote, governments adopt intellectual property laws in the belief that a privileged monopolistic domain operating on the margins of the free market economy promotes the long-term cultural and technological progress better than a regime of unbridled competition. So you can see the effect of patent and copyright is basically to protect people who have certain knowledge from competition when they use that knowledge in producing something on the free market. The entire purpose of patent and copyright is to protect people from competition. You can see here in this quote the fear of unbridled competition. Now, I don't have the best chart here. I used a free service to try to do this. But you can think of it this way. This is how most advocates of IP view the world. On the bottom axis, the horizontal axis, basically they're afraid of competition being too easy. So if it's too easy for someone to compete with you, then these people think there should be a law in place that will make it harder for people to compete with you, raise a barrier to entry, give you some kind of monopoly for a while, something like that. So for example, in the case of recipes, which I have in the middle of the bottom, what they see is the need for IP law increases as it gets easier to compete with people. So you can see that this is not really a pro-free market or a pro-competitive idea. In fact, one wonders if as competition gets easier in the realm of scarce goods, will these people start advocating protectionist or mercantilist type measures? I mean, Borders just went out of business because of competition from Amazon. Competition is getting easier in some ways nowadays, even in the realm of brick and mortar businesses and scarce resources because of the internet, because of expanding division of labor, because of increasing population, because of many developing countries coming into the capitalist system. So as we have more competition, the regular economy is going to approach the way the digital or the knowledge economy is. That is, there will be more competition. So will the people that advocate IP laws now be afraid of this increased competition? One thing to recognize is that this system is administered by the state, so it's no surprise that it does impose waste and costs on the economy in a variety of ways, and also because it's the grant of a monopoly privilege which stifles competition. So we can expect to see, so here's sort of where you can economically analyze the effect of state IP law. We can see what kind of results we would expect to see, and that we have seen. We can expect to see lots of costs, like litigation costs, reduced innovation, right? If you protect someone from competition, they don't have to innovate as much, and reduce competition and the formation of oligopolies. So let's just consider some of these costs here. So one of the costs would be lost innovation. So if a group of companies or one company dominates a given field with their early innovations, which they patent, let's say, outside companies are afraid are actually prohibited from entering that field, they're not going to bother investing resources to innovate in a field they can't compete in. So you definitely have lost innovation from patents. The proponents of the patent system would say the patent system incentivizes some innovation. I don't believe that's true, but even if it does, the point is it definitely also reduces some innovation. The patent system costs billions of dollars a year in addition to any innovation suppressing costs. I've estimated $41 billion a year in the US because of patents alone, and I think this is very conservative, to be honest. I wouldn't be surprised if it was hundreds of billions, and that's just the cost of US patents. Other costs of IP is it helps to justify the FDA system and its costs. These sort of feed on each other. People say, well, if you have an FDA system that regulates pharmaceutical companies, then we need to give these companies a patent monopoly to protect them from the increased costs they suffer under the FDA system. And there are arguments to go back the other way. And the US system is probably the worst, the most draconian patent and copyright system in the world. And I have a link to a blog post here, India Shrugging. There are some companies now that are afraid to enter the US market because they're just stepping on so many patents, they're afraid they're going to be sued. There are some software developers that are now withdrawing their apps from the Apple iOS market, etc. Just to give you a flavor of what this patent system encourages, let's take a look at some recent patent suits. So we have LoadSys now suing Apple iOS developers. We have the Android app is in serious trouble. I'm sorry, the Android smartphone platform is in serious trouble. Apple is suing Samsung over its Galaxy products. Of course, Samsung is striking back at Apple with 10 patents of its own. Microsoft is demanding that Samsung pay $15 royalties from every Android phone it sells. On the other hand, Microsoft's on the receiving end sometimes of these patents. I4I recently won $300 million from Microsoft in a patent infringement claim. Just in the last month or two, Nortel went out of business, went bankrupt, and had 6,000 patents that were being auctioned. And Google first bid $1 billion, or square root of 2 billion, and then they bid 2-something billion, and then they bid pi billion, 3.14 billion for the patents, and still lost. A consortium of rival smartphone makers, primarily RIM, which makes the BlackBerry, Microsoft, which makes the Windows Phone, Apple, the iPhone, and others came together in a consortium and bid $4.25 billion in the biggest patent sale in history to buy these 6,000 patents. And the reason they did it was because Google doesn't have a lot of patents. Google is one of the least offensive companies in this regard. And Google, let's say, has 700 patents. So Google and their Android platform is vulnerable to being sued by rivals like Apple, as we see in the earlier bullet points higher on the page. So Google wanted these 6,000 patents not to go around suing people and extorting money from people, not for shakedown purposes, but simply it's like a porcupine defense. Google wanted to have a big arsenal of patents to make Apple and Microsoft and RIM and others afraid to sue them, because if Apple sues Google for patent infringement, then Apple knows that Google can pour through its 7,000 high stack of patents and find something that Apple may be infringing and countersue them. And so basically, all these large companies have these patents solely to keep each other from suing each other. And of course, the small guys on the outside have no defense. They have no quills. There are no porcupine quills. So they can be sued by anyone inside these sort of walled garden, so they don't enter the field. They're afraid to. Moreover, if they're sued, they can't even afford the $3 million say, legal fees, not to mention the $300 million damage award if they were to lose. You can see what this does is it creates oligopolies, oligopolized industries who are protected from competition by raised barriers to entry. But in any case, these companies bid $4.5 billion just to keep Google from having a defensive shield. So this is one case where our normal opposition to the FTC and the antitrust law might be a little bit. I wouldn't cry if the FTC were to look at this consortium of Apple, Microsoft, and Sony, and RIM, and others using the monopoly granted by the state, the patents, in a monopolistic way, although we couldn't endorse that. Now, RIM, on the other hand, struck a licensing deal with Intellectual Ventures, one of these patent trolls, for 30,000 of their IP assets. So, and RIM, the BlackBerry maker, had previously had to pay $600 million to NTP for patent infringement. So you can see most of these companies are being hurt and helped by the patent system, although overall they're being helped in the sense that outside competition from small upstarts is quashed. And there's some other results here. This is a slightly older chart just showing just some of the patent lawsuits in the mobile smartphone area as of a couple years ago. I mean, this is not the free market. I just updated this last night. Just yesterday, Google's general counsel, Kent Walker, said because they lost this pi billion-dollar bid for the Nortel patents, he said, well, software patents are kind of gumming up the works in innovation. I just wonder, kind of, and just software patents? I guarantee that the patents that Apple and RIM and Microsoft have are not just software patents that they're using, targeting the Android system with. The problem is patents in general, not just software patents. Now, what other costs of IP are there? Well, they're also used to justify restrictions on free trade, even by libertarians and free market economists. In particular, in the case of the drug reimport situation, where the FDA regulates drugs, only authorizes certain drugs, approved drugs to be sold, and they're patented usually, and the manufacturers in the U.S. will export them to other countries like Canada, which have price controls. So they have to sell these drugs at a reduced price, say in Canada. Now, we're not in favor of price controls, but evidently Bayer and others think they can make a profit selling it at $100 instead of $300 or whatever. So you have a drug that's been legally manufactured and sold to a buyer in Canada, and this drug is then reimported to the U.S., just resold. This is just arbitrage. Now, it doesn't violate the patent law because there's something called the exhaustion doctrine, which means the maker can only take one bite out of the apple. When they sold it legally in Canada, they've already exhausted their patent monopoly, so they can't complain about it that way. So, of course, what they do is they get the FDA to block the import, saying that, well, we haven't approved it yet, even though it's the same drug by the same company that's approved in the U.S., but it's sold in Canada first, so it's not approved here. And you have free market economists, Richard Epstein, Doug Bandow from Cato, Michael Krauss, arguing against reimportation of drugs, arguing that the federal government, through the FTC or other means, should prohibit free trade because it'd be a way of getting around the patent rights of U.S. pharmaceutical companies. So you can see how this patent mentality corrupts even the free trade bona fides of libertarians and free market economists. It also leads to calls for extensions extensions of the patent system. I mentioned earlier, fashion is being lobbied for now, et cetera, and American and Western imperialism. Internationally, through the World Trade Organization and this ACTA treaty, they're trying to twist the arms of other countries, Russia, China, India, to adopt American-style IP law. They're trying to extend it to other fields like fashion, even mixed drinks. Bartenders want that. Recipes, newspaper headlines in Germany. They want a copyright on the headline of a newspaper article. And they're expanding the penalties. It's like the drug war, right? The drug war, they always want to ramp up the drug war and impose a death penalty, put people in jail for longer times. Same thing is going on here as people are more and more able to evade IP law, especially with the internet, encryption, torrenting, file sharing. What they're doing is they're trying to increase the penalties, including a no due process, administrative accusation of 3 strikes and you're out and you're banned from the internet for life. These kinds of things are coming. It's scary. Now, what about other costs of IP? Well, first of all, it makes everyone a criminal. Everyone. There's a study by John Teheranian where he estimates that by typical activities most people that have access to the internet engage in every year, we each rack up a liability of $4.5 billion a year, each person. This is not even an exaggeration. This is literally true. This is the effect of these laws, and you can see it in some of the notorious examples that we've seen. Jamie Thomas, some single mother who downloaded like 18 songs and ended up losing and being fined millions of dollars, things like this. It also leads to calls for federal government stimulation of innovation through taxes, because after all, the argument is that if we don't have patent and copyright law, there will be a suboptimal production of songs and music and inventions right? So in some ideal world, we're going to have this much, but we only have this much because of market failure, right? The public goods problem. So the government comes in, gives these monopolies, raises the level back to where it should be. Well, how do we know that we're at the optimal level, right? Maybe the patent system helps get us to a higher level of innovation, but not quite high enough. Maybe the real ideal level is even higher. And in fact, this is what a lot of IP advocates call for. They call for the federal government to tax people, collect the money, give it to a panel of government-appointed experts and bureaucrats, and look around the country and see whose innovation that year is deserving of a little reward, and hand out the rewards. And in fact, even some free market economists have called for an $80 billion taxpayer-funded innovation prize just for medical technology, just for medical. So if you think of all the areas that patents cover, chemical, electrical, software, business methods, and if you think about other types of IP, copyright, if you scale this up, it could be trillions a year of taxpayer robbery to incentivize innovation, even beyond what the patent monopoly could do. And in fact, one of these free market guys even supports for the arts what he calls artistic freedom vouchers, $20 billion a year to give money to creators and artists. And of course, there are other costs of IP, death, jail, and censorship. There are literally people dying today in America because of patents or going to jail or being threatened for jail. There's a recent lawsuit where some guy owning a patent is trying to force Ford not to use certain safety features in their car because it violates their patent. Now, they really want money from Ford, but the implicit threat is, if you don't pay me money, I will use the courts to make you take this safety feature out of the car. People would die because of the patent. There is a case going on right now where there is a maker called Genzyme, which makes a drug called Fabrazyme, which is for a rare disease, and it is short supply because only one company has the patent, and they're selling most of the drug to Europe because they have a better profit there because of this particular case. And so there are Americans who can't buy the drug, and there are no competitors because competition is outlawed. Now, there is one substitute drug being made in Europe, but it can't be imported here because the FDA hasn't approved it. So it also leads to forum shopping. Marshall, Texas, not too far from Houston, is the patent litigation capital of the world because they give the highest awards. There's a whole industry there. It leads to patent trolls like Intellectual Ventures and copyright trolls like the notorious Right Haven. Copyright is literally and often used for censorship. Howard Hughes one time, for example, almost succeeded in using copyright to try to block a biography he didn't like. He just bought the copyrights to some information that was going to be used in some biographies. Some filmmakers have used it to censor criticism. J.D. Salinger got a court to literally order a sequel, an unauthorized sequel to Catcher in the Rye, to be blocked from publication by a U.S. court. It's literally censorship and thought control. Now, patents, from the examples I gave earlier, it also should be clear that patents lead to a lot of waste. You have these companies spending billions of dollars for patents that only serve to keep their competitors, their big competitors, from suing them. So this is just a deadweight loss in society, and it reduces competition from smaller upstarts. So I've already mentioned this, so let me go on here. Now, Rothbard talks about another effect of patents, for example, in the market, and that is that patents are always arbitrary in what they cover. They reward some types of things, but some types of inventions and innovation are outside the scope of patents. For example, mathematical algorithms or certain types of medical procedures nowadays. What you have then, and certain abstract other like theories of physics, E equals mc squared was not patentable by Einstein, for example, even though it was also beneficial to mankind, although Einstein actually didn't invent E equals mc squared, so bad example. But so as Rothbard points out, when the patent system will give you a monopoly over a certain type of innovation, people are going to tend to divert their R&D efforts in that direction. So this distorts the economy from what it otherwise would be. Milton Friedman also recognized this, that the existence of patents tends to divert activity towards patentable inventions. So it doesn't have a neutral effect on the market. It distorts the market. Now, what about empirical studies about these claims that patents actually improve innovation? I'll just go through a few of these here. But basically, economists regularly and almost universally concede that there's no evidence, and in fact, the evidence is the other way around. Levine says empirically IP doesn't increase creation and innovation. Fritz Machlup in '58 said that economists do not have enough information to conclude that the patent system confers a net benefit or loss. He says, we just don't know. We can't know the answer to these things. George Priest in '86, in the current state of knowledge, economists know almost nothing about the effect of social welfare on social welfare of the patent system. A recent study in '04 by two French economists concludes something similar, that we don't know anything anymore now than we knew in Machlup's day when he concluded that we just can't know. A recent study by two law professors, Muir and Benson, they conclude empirically, on average, the patent system discourages innovation. Okay? So, these are the effects, this is the economic analysis of state IP. It reduces competition, it raises barriers to entry, creates oligopolies, reduces innovation, creates societal waste and cost, distorts R&D, does injustice to individuals, causes rent-seeking and ever-expanding laws along the lines of controls breed controls. Now, let's switch to free market IP, or knowledge. So the role of knowledge in a free society, as we talked about already, greater knowledge expands the universe of ends and means, it improves action, it increases efficiency and wealth, it enables human progress, and more societal knowledge is good. This is what allows human progress over time. The pool of knowledge we can all draw on to make our decisions about what means to use, what ends to pursue, always grows. This is why, or one reason why, we have societal progress. Now, let's get to sort of what I was aiming at through all this preliminary talk. What are the sources of wealth? So we're talking about economic development. As Hoppe explains, there are only three ways to generate wealth. You can acquire and increase wealth either through homesteading, production, and contractual exchange. Those are the only three ways. Or through expropriating that from others. So let's look at these three types. We have original appropriation, that is, you're taking something that was unowned out of the commons. That is a way of creating new property. That's the only way to create new property. So that is a way of increasing wealth. The person who homesteads something is better off after the acquisition. Production now means not to create something new out of nothing. It means to transform property you already own, and that also creates wealth. If you beat metal into a sword, now you have a more valuable object to you, something that's more valuable to you. You've created wealth. You use knowledge to do that, but you don't create new property titles. And finally, there's trade, or contractual exchange. Now, of course, when two people make an exchange, each one is better off after the exchange. They're not equal. It's not true that if you pay $100 for an iPod, that the iPod is worth $100. The iPod is worth more than $100 to you, and the $100 is worth more than the iPod to Apple. Okay, so both parties are better off after the exchange. And this is implicit in Rothbard's toward a reconstruction of utility and welfare economics. Okay? So the only way that we can guarantee that there's wealth generated in society and that everyone is better off is if there is no aggression and property rights are respected. So when you have property rights and when you have contract simply means the right of the owner of property to do what he wants with it. He's the one who gets to give permission, so someone can use his property, or to deny permission, or in the case of external resources, to alienate it or to sell it to others. So when you have property rights in contract, you have a free market that leads to trade, and wealth is created in that way. And in production, this is universally recognized by the great libertarian thinkers, Rothbard, Rand, Mises, and Hoppe. They all explain that we create wealth by rearranging resources that we own already. Now, there's a common fallacy that we produce things, and this is actually part of the Randian mistake about IP. They think, well, if you produce something, you own it, and we produce ideas that are valuable, so we should own those. But the mistake they're making is they're overusing or misusing a metaphor. When we say we produce something, all we mean is we transform something owned already. We make it more valuable. So you can see Rand recognized this in another context. She said, the power to rearrange is the only creative power we possess. Creation does not bring something into existence out of nothing. It just means to bring into existence an arrangement. Of course, you have to own some object to rearrange it. Rothbard said the same thing, or something similar. He said that men can work with numerous elements he finds in his environment. These are scarce means, by rearranging them in order to bring about the satisfaction of his ends. And of course, Rothbard has been accused of borrowing his ideas from Rand, which is false. As we can see, Mises wrote, even before both of them, something very similar, that there's a widespread misconception about the nature of production. So he talks about this naive view that it's bringing something into existence that didn't previously exist. But he says, no, what production is you combine your personal forces, that's your human action, with the forces of nature, these are scarce resources in the world, so that you bring about a particular desired arrangement of material. And he says here, no human act of production amounts to more than altering the position of things in space and leaving the rest to nature. That means using causal laws. Okay? So how does knowledge and the free market play a role in these three sources of wealth? Original appropriation, trade, and production or transformation. So we can focus on three aspects of the market which enhance or enable these three ways of creating wealth. So we first have, in an advanced free market economy, when property rights are respected, we can expect to see cooperation among people. They're not just isolated. We don't have Crusoe economics. We have an advanced society with cooperation where people can use each other as means, in Mises' sense. And the division of labor and the specialization of labor. We also have the continual acquisition of knowledge or learning and emulation by people. And we have market competition. So let's look at each of these three things in turn and see how they affect the three primary sources of wealth generation. So learning is acquiring knowledge. When you have property rights respected and freedom, then people will learn. They'll learn from others, they'll learn from the culture that we've been born into, and from observing other people, even other people on the market, even their competitors. And they'll sometimes emulate them, right? This leads to the acquisition of more knowledge. You know, if you see a competitor open a grocery store and have wider supermarket aisles and attracts more customers, you've learned something about the way the world works. So as we discussed earlier, this enlarges your universe of possible ends and means, which enhances wealth. When you have more ends, as we discussed earlier, when you know of more possible ends, then we can have greater wealth satisfaction, lower opportunity costs. I gave the cake example earlier, but you could also think of this, instead of building, if you need to cross a river or have a way to cross a river, you could build a long road around it or build a boat. But now, if you know that there's a bridge is possible, that's your end. You might choose to build a bridge instead, right? And a larger universe of possible means also enhances wealth creation. It allows a more efficient use of causal laws to achieve our ends. For example, instead of making a bridge on beams or on arches, now we could make it with a cable. That's another means we know of to make a bridge. So how does this play a role in the creation of wealth? So the greater knowledge of possible ends and means, technical knowledge, scientific knowledge, causal knowledge, even cultural knowledge, and artistic knowledge, it helps you be a better homesteader. For example, instead of throwing oil away as being some kind of a bad, now you're aware that oil can be used productively. So you now homestead the oil productively. Now your wealth is increased. Production, of course, when you transform goods, if you know of better techniques to transform the iron into steel instead of just an iron sword, you make a better sword, right? Or you might make a car instead of a chariot. And even contractual exchange could be enhanced by more knowledge because the parties know more about how they can use the things they're trading, they know more about possible trades out there, they know more about other prices that have been exchanged in the market, etc. So all three ways of creating wealth are enhanced by greater knowledge. And finally, of course, competition. When competition is permitted on the market, when IP laws don't come in and protect market actors from competition, then emulation is possible. And emulation leads to competition, leads to constant striving to satisfy consumers, to increase efficiency and lower costs. And you can use better means to do this if you know of more possibilities. You can innovate, you improve products, so you have more production and more trade. So basically, competition, emulation, the division of labor, cooperation, and the spread of knowledge, possibility of learning on the market leads to immense wealth creation and the improvement of living standards, technological, economic, and social progress. Thank you. I'll take questions now.